So the last of our Unit 4 materials, and we're going to talk about World War I and the eventual ending of World War I and the American impact from it. So in 1914, Europe was experienced what historians often refer to as the main causes of World War I. It's an acronym. It stands for militarism, alliances, imperialist competition, and nationalism. Most important of those is the N, nationalism. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The militarism is that all of these countries in Europe had started to spend a lot of money on building up big armies. And they're irritable with each other because each of these big European countries was out in the world trying to gather imperialist colonies. So they're kind of rubbing up against each other, and they have these big armies, and they're just kind of they're gathering the fuel that's going to end up burning the European continent. Okay. Nationalism is important because all of these different colors around here are national groups. Okay, so nation does not mean the same thing as country. A country can have many nationalities within it, and each one of these different colors is a different nationality within the bigger country of Austria-Hungary. And the national people that we're looking at here is the Serbians down in Bosnia, particularly in the city of Sarajevo. Now, this ethnic nationalist group wanted to have a Serbian country. We call it a nation state. And a group known as, I believe, the Black Hand were willing to use violence to achieve that goal. They were tired of living underneath the Austro-Hungarians. And when on a day of Serbian nationalism and Serbian pride, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, came into Sarajevo, the heart of Serbia, Serbian territory, he is going to be attacked and killed by Serbian nationalists. In particular, this guy right here, I believe his name is Giovanni Principe. And as a result of the murder of the Archduke, the alliance system will kick in. The alliances within Europe had balanced out the power within Europe for a while, for about 100 years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So for every France, there would be a Germany. For every Britain, there's an Austria-Hungary. For every Russia, there's a Turkey. And the idea was that with all of the powers, they're offsetting each other so that nobody would be willing to actually start a big war because they know that they'd be thumped down. That works great for about 100 years, and then it doesn't. So what happens is, here's the Serbian, right? Serbia is threatened by Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary wants to punish Serbians for killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Well, that means that the alliance system kicks in, and the Serbian has an alliance with Russia. Russia then declares that they will move on Austria-Hungary. When that happens, Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, declares war on Russia. But because Russia is allied with Britain and France, that means France and Britain are going to have to join into this war as well. And what ends up happening is that Russia mobilizes for war. When Russia mobilizes, and it takes them a little while to get to the border, Germany sees that France is Russia's ally. So Germany kicks in to plan the Schlieffen Plan, and they swing through Belgium. Belgium was an ally of Britain. So they swing through Belgium, bringing Britain into the war, attack France. France is also an England's ally. And they try to capture Paris. The French are not dummies. They know that that's what Germany is going to try to do. So they have a counter plan called the Plan 13, where they're going to cross through this mountainous territory and try to get to Berlin first. They end up flipping, and then over the next period of a few months, they are going to flip back, and the battle lines are drawn. And I mean that literally. There will be a trench line dug almost from the coast down to the middle of France where everything just stops. We call this the War of the Shovel and the Machine Gun because this is characterized by trench warfare. They dig these deep trenches. Good ones are about 6 feet deep so people can walk through them. They are not a pleasant place to be. They have rats and diseases and water filled, and they're not comfortable, and it's loud, and there's always this fear of people coming over into your trench, and it's just not comfortable warfare. And eventually the Germans are going to figure out poison gas, which is heavier than air, which goes in and settles in the trenches. When you jump out to get away from the gas, they mow you down with machine guns. It's horrific warfare. And over 3 years, the main powers, the Triple Entente, which we're going to call the Allied powers, and the Central powers, which are going to be called the Central powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, are going to just bludgeon each other with no hope of final victory. In a single battle, which lasted about 6 weeks, the Battle of, I believe the Battle of the Somme, it could be the Battle of Verdun, it doesn't matter, it's not on the test, about 500,000 people are going to be killed over a 6-week period because of the barbaric nature of this war. Back home, America initially reacted by staying out of the war. And the reason for this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States will stay out of European affairs as long as Europe stays out of the Western Hemisphere. And Wilson and Americans mostly are going to support the Allies. There's a British blockade, meaning that the British are not allowing American ships to go into Germany. So there's a British blockade trying to prevent the United States from selling items to Germany. Britain also controls the news cables that are coming from Europe. So the United States is really only getting the propaganda from Great Britain. Then, because the Germans are trying to break the British blockade, the Germans are going to start committing unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, the British are already violating America's right to the seas with the blockade, but the Germans are going to be more aggressive, and they're going to blow up some ships with Americans on board. The Germans were trying to break the blockade by using submarines, which would attack unseen at any time, and it's a terrifying weapon. One of the ships that they sank was the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was a British passenger ship, and it went into the unrestricted submarine warfare zone, and the Germans sunk it. As a passenger ship, there was 128 Americans on board, and it kills all of them. The United States is outraged, and the United States gets Germany to promise not to sink any more ships. As it turns out, following some investigation, the Lusitania was carrying weapons into Germany, so Germany kind of had the right to sink it. But because of the American outrage, Germany agreed to stop submarine warfare for a while. The United States, following all of this, the submarine warfare, and all the information from Britain, and the fact that the United States is only trading with England, starts preparing for war. They grow the military from 90,000 to 223,000 soldiers. They start their own propaganda, like this here. This is supposed to make one think of the sinking of the Lusitania, and it simply says enlist, but it's a pretty white woman with a baby sinking to the bottom of the ocean, trying to make Americans mad about the sinking of the Lusitania. Then we get this. So America is growing its military, but the United States is staying out of the war. Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election in 1916, and Woodrow Wilson is running on a campaign, and you can see that right up here, that he kept us out of the war, right? You can see that right above my head right here. He kept us out of the war. Peace with honor. And after Wilson is reelected, the Germans, kind of seeing the writing on the wall, restart unrestricted submarine warfare. They know that the United States is eventually going to get into this war now that the election is over and Wilson has a little bit more leeway to do what he wants. They see the United States as becoming unofficial allies of the French and the British. And the United States becomes even more worried about the freedom of the seas now because of this unrestricted submarine warfare. Then all heck breaks loose. Now here, propaganda artists and political cartoonists love stereotypes. So if you look at this bottom guy here, right, wearing a sombrero, that's Mexico. And up here, this is Germany, right? You see the pointy hat, he's Germany. And Germany is offering Mexico money in order to take back, what is this? Take back all of this territory. Remember the Mexican-American War, the Mexican Cession, all that territory that the United States basically took from Mexico. Germany is offering that back to the Mexicans if they attack the United States and if they win. And this was all detailed in an intercepted telegram called the Zimmerman telegram or the Zimmerman note. Zimmerman is the ambassador that sent it. And the British intercepted it, from Germany to Mexico, give it to the United States. And it said that Germany wanted Mexico to attack the United States. That way, the United States would be busy over here and not get involved in World War I. This outrages the United States, and they might as well have attacked the United States directly because now they want revenge. And in April 1917, America entered the war after some more ships were sunk by submarines. Some historians have also argued one of the biggest reasons the Americans entered the war is because of all of these exports. See all those exports? That's all stuff that's being sent to Europe between 1914 and 1917. And Europe didn't have enough money to pay for it all. So they were borrowing money in order to pay for it from American institutions. And the fear was that if Britain lost the war, then they wouldn't be able to pay off their debts, and that would ruin the American economy. So the United States gets involved because of the debts, because they wanted to make sure that they got paid back. So the United States begins recruiting, and see here, these are women in the workforce. They did it before World War II. Women had always been in the workforce, but at this point, there is a 4 million worker shortage here. And those 4 million men had gone to war, so they needed people to replace them. African Americans began moving from the South to the North in what's called the Great Migration. Women joined the workforce. As a result, they're later going to be rewarded with the 19th Amendment, giving them suffrage rights. And both of them faced discrimination when the war is over. The United States also needed to manage the payments for the war. They didn't really increase the income tax. So they needed some way to pay for the war, and they're going to do it through borrowing, and they're going to use deficit spending. They didn't call it that. They sold Liberty bonds. Now, Liberty bond, we're also going to call it war bonds, were essentially loans that a private individual would give the government to help finance the war. The government would spend that money and then pay them back after a period of time, usually about 25 years. They'd get some return with interest. So Liberty bonds are just loans from individuals to help pay for the war. And please remember, they're still fighting in a segregated military. That's going to become important in World War II. Back to the Great Migration real quick. African Americans are leaving the South and they're heading north. And there's push factors and pull factors. And the things that are pushing them away from the South, the things that they're running away from, Jim Crow laws that are legal segregation, lynchings, which are the violent implementation of social obligations, and sharecropping, which is that indebtedness to the land. So they're running away from all of that debt and violence and segregation. They're going up to northern cities. And what's pulling them up to the northern cities? Jobs in the defense industry, right? We just said 4 million people needed to be replaced. So they're going up north and working in the defense industry, but also they're going to work and live in ethnic neighborhoods, places like Harlem in New York City, where they're going to be with people like them and they can feel more comfortable and they're not going to be afraid of getting lynched. Oh, let's talk about propaganda real quick. Don't talk. All right. The war is going to become very unpopular very quickly. In fact, the war was already unpopular because the United States has seen 3 years of World War I. So the government needed to justify their actions, justify going to war, and they're going to do it through a lot of propaganda. Local people really bought into it. They began to change German words. So like you could go to the store, but you couldn't buy bratwurst. You could buy victory sausage. You couldn't buy sauerkraut. You could buy Liberty cabbage, but no German stuff. Books will be burned that are written in German or about Germans. They even lynched some Germans just to really let the message get through that they didn't like them. All of that's necessary because there is about 8 million people of German descent living in the United States, and the fear was that they would support Germany instead of the United States. There are going to be a loss of civil liberties. The United States passes the Espionage and Sedition Act, which forbids speaking against the government and its war efforts, which kind of violates the whole First Amendment thing. But it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said in Schenck versus the United States in 1919 that the famous phrase is, "You can't shout fire in a crowded theater." Essentially what Schenck says, though, is that your free speech is limited if it is going to cause harm to others or the country. So we see that there are limits on the First Amendment rights. Now we're just going to have to try to find where all those limits are. Socialist leader Eugene Debs even claims World War I is exploitation of the working class, essentially that the people that caused the war were the rich people that just wanted to sell a lot of weapons, and it's the working class that are fighting each other in Germany and the Allied state against the Allies. And that if all the working class just stopped fighting, then the rich people would lose out on profits and the war would stop. And because he said that, he gets thrown in prison for 10 years. He ran for president while he was in prison, by the way. He got about 1 million votes. In the end, the Espionage and Sedition Act showed that sometimes the national interest is given priority over individual rights. Because of World War I, we're going to see this is going to have huge impacts on both the labor movement and immigration, even going into the 1920s. Immigration was seen as potentially causing a poison of disloyalty, that there was this pseudoscience, this fake science that somehow immigrants were the enemy, that they were different, and is based on fear and racism. They're going to pass the 1917 Immigration Act, which basically uses Jim Crow tactics to keep people out. You can see down here, this side, literacy tests were used to keep immigrants from coming to the United States. There's also going to be a war on labor unions, right? Labor unions can go on strike to try to help increase wages and hours. But during war, it was seen as disloyal to not just give everything you could for the country. So immigrants were seen as the core of unions, because it's un-American to be part of a union, apparently. So that made unions bad. But also, if you were fighting for shorter hours, that was like saying that you didn't want to work for the country. So immigrants and labor unions are going to really suffer during World War I. All of that kind of ties into what happens in Russia in 1917. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution happens. The Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Russia, is going to be overthrown and brutally murdered along with his family. But the Bolsheviks, which were an extremist communist organization, take over. This is Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had promised land, bread, and peace to the people of Russia. So when they take over the country, they immediately sign a peace treaty with Germany, which means now Germany and Austria-Hungary can fight only on one front. They don't have to fight Russia on one side and France on the other, which made the Allies nervous. They redistributed land and tried to make sure that everybody was fed, which sounds like great goals, but communism isn't going to really work, and it's not going to work that way in the end. So now the only groups that are left, because the Tsar had been an absolute dictator, right, an absolute monarchist. So now, France and Britain are the only sides left on the Allied side. They're both constitutional democracies. So now Woodrow Wilson can go to Congress and say that we must join these constitutional democracies against the emperor in Austria-Hungary and the king in Germany, so that we can make the world safe for democracy. Asks Congress to declare war on Germany. They do, and the United States Army is sent over. Real quick, this is the 369th Infantry. You probably have heard of them, called the Harlem Hellfighters. Again, segregated unit, all-black regiment. Because of racism, they had mostly white officers. But even with that, they're going to become one of the most dedicated units in World War I. Decorated, not dedicated, decorated. They're going to win a lot of medals. But even though they spent 191 days fighting, became very decorated soldiers, they're going to go back home and face racism and segregation from their own countrymen. One of the reasons that historians think that Wilson got into the war was so he could try to help set the peace terms for after the war. And following the Great War, also called the Great Conflagration, World War I, Woodrow Wilson is going to suggest 14 points that would help secure peace for our future. He was trying to prevent future great wars, and he comes up with this plan when he decides to get the United States into the war. The three big points are self-determination for all nations. That means that every little nationality that was on that map at the beginning should have their own state. That every nationality should be able to determine their own statehood. Second is freedom of the seas. No more blockades, no more unrestricted submarine warfare, and that would keep people happy. And thirdly, and most importantly for him, a League of Nations. And this means there would be a place where countries could come together and talk out their problems rather than just pulling out their guns. That sounds great. It's not all going to come to pass. Now, Americans are going to come in. They are going to be referred to as doughboys because they're so much bigger in relief for the British and the French. And they are going to tip the war into the hands of the Allies and quickly pushed past the tired German forces. Germany collapsed in November of 1917, and armistice was called, a truce was called November 11th at 11 a.m., and we now refer to that as Veterans Day. There's a lot of casualties involved on both sides. It is the bloodiest war in human history up until that point. Bad, 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 bad. Here's the party in New York in 1918. Yay! And then Wilson has to go to France to try to help make the peace. And he makes a couple of mistakes along the way. One, Wilson went to France. He's the first president to leave, and he forgot to take Republicans with him. Wilson is a Democrat. Republicans wanted to have a say in what happened at the conference, and he only undertook Democrats, which means he's going to be behind the political 8 ball when he gets home. He goes to Paris, and he doesn't read the room. He doesn't understand that the British and the French, after 4 or 5 years of fighting, after suffering millions in casualties, they don't want to set a peace that's going to bring peace in the future. They want to punish Germany. So Britain and France aren't really interested in those 14 points that Wilson has. He's going to have to negotiate in order to get what he can out of those 14 points. In order to get what he wants, he allows the war guilt clause and the reparations clause to be put into the treaty that ends World War I. The war guilt clause required Germany to accept guilt for starting the war, which, if you think back 20 minutes ago, they didn't. It was an Austro-Hungarian a Serbian who killed an Austro-Hungarian, which led the Austro-Hungarians to try to punish Serbia, which brought in Russia, which brought in Germany. And they're going to require reparations. Now, the reason that they needed the war guilt clause was because they wanted Germany to pay all of the bills. That $7 to $10 billion that they owed the United States, they wanted Germany to pay for that. The British said, we can't pay for it. Somebody's got to, so we're going to make the Germans. In exchange for getting those two things, which is just going to set up World War II, Wilson gets the League of Nations put into the treaty. Now, the League of Nations was that thing where the countries could get together to talk, and it's included. But most of the other League of Nations, most of the other 14 points are going to be rejected. And then the League of Nations is going to be rejected when Wilson gets back home with this treaty. There is a debate on whether or not to accept the treaty, and it's really wrapped up nicely in this cartoon here. The Republicans, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, are going to oppose the League of Nations. Part of that is they're mad that they didn't be included in the whole Paris trip. But part of it is they were worried that the United States would lose its sovereignty to other countries. Now, remember, the Republicans in the Senate control the Senate. The Senate has to ratify the treaty that Wilson just negotiated. They had to sign off on it. So he needs Republican support. But they're worried that the United States will no longer become its own country if it accepts the League of Nations. You can see here, Japan, over there, England, over here, other foreign nations are tying the United States up through the League of Nations, and the United States won't be able to do what it wants. Wilson tries to appeal directly to the people. He tries to make it an issue in the re-election campaign in 1920. So he goes out on this big whistle-stop train tour. He has a stroke while he's campaigning for the treaty, becomes ineffective at speaking, and dies shortly thereafter. But the American people rejected the treaty. So they never actually accepted the League of Nations. In fact, the United States had to sign a separate peace treaty with Germany. Americans want to go back to isolationism. They just saw 4 or 5 years of Europeans murdering each other. They saw their own sons go off to fight a war that they didn't believe in. They wanted to go and move back to isolationism and maintain neutrality. Warren G. Harding, the presidential nominee in 1920, called this a return to normalcy. So we're going to get this return to normalcy. The treaty fails. It's rejected by the people in the Senate, and the United States is going to enter into the 1920s on this path towards isolation. Women do get the right to vote. The amendment is passed in 1920, almost as kind of like a thank you. There's a little bit of economic turbulence following World War I when the United States transitions from a wartime economy back to a civilian economy. Labor unions that had been really punished underneath the war industry transition. They're going to strike. There's going to be some riots. There's going to be more fear of radicals, which is going to lead to nativism and xenophobia in the 1920s. And there are some race riots. The Red Summer of 1919 shows us that because of the Great Migration of all of those soldiers moving up into those northern cities, and they're moving into black neighborhoods, the black neighborhoods expand, and they're going to start bumping into white neighborhoods. And where that friction occurs is when the white soldiers start returning back from war, and they see people either in their jobs or in their neighborhoods of different color, and there's going to be a bunch of race riots. Almost all the riots are going to be white folks that are going to start attacking the black neighborhoods. We're going to see the first Red Scare, which is something we'll talk about more, and all of these great war effects are going to lead us into the 1920s.